Good afternoon from San Francisco. I'm Alex Webb, and this is my colleague Mark Bergen. This is Apple This Week. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're already there, please feel free to send us questions in the course of this discussion. We're going to be talking a lot today about Apple and their relationship to Samsung on a number of different levels. Firstly, of course, the big news of the week generally across the mobile devices industry has been the fairly catastrophic happenings over at Samsung and the fires that have been cropping up in a whole bunch of Galaxy Note 7s. I think we've got a video here. Mark, do you want to hit play?
Yeah, sure. Nice visual. Shows some of the damage. Does not show some of the billions of dollars that was knocked off Samsung's market cap. This has been sort of a disaster for them on a global scale. So they recalled the Note 7, which is their kind of high-end big screen phone, which presents a lot of opportunities for Apple, right? I mean, you talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I mean, so I think Samsung said yesterday they're expecting their profit to be cut by $2.3 billion as a consequence, and that's the bottom line, frankly, the profit, clearly, not just revenue, so that's a big hit for them. And yeah, the Note 7 was their flagship high-end device, competing directly with the iPhone, so it seems to be, a space which Apple could potentially fill. The question I think is interesting, Mark, clearly you write a lot about Google. If it might be creating opportunities for Apple, but then how do you evaluate the Google situation here?
Right, because last week Google put out Pixel, which is their first manufactured phone. They're controlling every bit of the parts, and it's also a high-priced phone, a similar size. So it does create some avenues where, especially if you're an Android user, you're more comfortable in Android, you might switch over to Google. Pixel's a very new brand, does not spend as much. Right now, Google's marketing budget probably won't get anywhere near what Samsung does globally. So I think that to someone like Huawei, Xiaomi, LG, some of the Chinese brands that are doing really well will probably have a better chance here. I do think actually it's a mixed bag for Google because they have more opportunity with the Pixel, but Samsung is their biggest Android manufacturer right now. That's they're probably very worried about a lot of people leaving Android and going to Apple.
I mean, clearly the exposure that Samsung has to any one device is probably less in relative terms than it would be at Apple, for example, where the iPhone accounts for almost 2/3 of their revenue. At Samsung, I was digging up some numbers on the Bloomberg terminal. Their entire mobile handset revenue is about 88 billion of their $177 billion total, so it's about 45%. Within that, of course, then the Note 7 is a yet smaller percentage.
Right.
So, but then, of course, there is still the risk that the brand damage carries over into their other devices. You and I know, and I'm sure that a lot of people out there know, that it is just this one particular device. But there might also be consumers who are like, "Oh, Samsung phones are exploding," and they don't recognize
Samsung washing machines, Samsung fridges, right? I mean, Samsung's, and last week I think their earnings came out. They actually beat the numbers. They did pretty well. Some of their semiconductor business is going pretty strong. But they're also looking in the consumer side. They're trying to do wearables. They're expanding into a lot more devices, to Internet of Things and connected devices. And this probably will hurt them there, right? Maybe as consumers immediately associate Samsung with explosion. It's certainly not good.
I mean, one of the things that is interesting is, as you say, like the risk of Android losing FaceTime with customers in terms of the device they're using.
Right.
It's still quite hard to port all your data from one device to another. I know Google's tried to make that easier in the direction towards people switching from iPhones to Androids. But I think that is then clearly the risk for Google. They lose that customer relationship somehow.
Right, and also kind of, you said earlier, it just demonstrates that Apple has a really tight control over their supply chain. And that's something that Google's been really envious of, and I know a lot of other handset makers. Another big news this week is also Apple and Samsung have had this long, drawn-out patent case. There was a ruling yesterday that said that it might even
evaluated,
that said that this could even draw out longer.
Yeah, I mean, it's frankly, I'd forgotten about the smartphone intellectual property wars, and I was reminded yesterday they're not yet over, but they're potentially in the death throes, the end of these wars. There was a fine imposed on Samsung for copying Apple's design property, essentially, and the $399 million award, which Samsung was supposed to pay to Apple, had been appealed by Samsung, and it went to the Supreme Court yesterday. The hearing was in Washington, and question really is whether the thing that Apple is disputing, or Samsung is disputing, is whether the fact that they might have copied some of the design attributes of the iPhone, does that mean they have to pay all of the profits they got from these phones to Apple? And that's essentially what the financial award was to begin with. They're disputing that. There was an interesting comment from Justice Samuel Alito, who said that nobody buys a car, even a Beetle, just because they like the way it looks. So, if it is ultimately decided by the Supreme Court that a similarity to in design renders all of the profit attributable then to the original designer, well, that could open a can of worms, is the argument being made by Google and Facebook and others.
Yeah, so Google, Facebook, eBay, HP have all put in documents in the case saying that a victory for Apple would not be good for them. It would not be good for kind of the tech industry at large. It does seem like reading it through, the justices were sort of didn't really know what to do with a smartphone as a product, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's not pretty clear cut. It's not even. It's it's not. What was there was some quote. It's like it's not like carpeting or something, right? Like, it's not one product, it's a much more complex thing, and Apple can't take credit for everything.
And clearly the levels of secrecy that they have doesn't help either, because it's hard then to see, people don't want to be too open about what exactly their intellectual property is and what is the secrets what are the secrets under the hood of how this stuff works.
What do you think is the implication for Apple if they lose, or if they don't get everything they want?
I mean, I don't think it's the end of the world. And one of the things that our colleagues, Greg Storr and Susan Decker, made when they were previewing this case on Monday is that, frankly, Apple and Google have both got far bigger fish to fry at the moment. Apple's got its whole tax imbroglio in Europe, and Samsung, of course, has the exploding phones that they're having to deal with. So I'm not sure it's at the top of their list of priorities at the moment. We have got some questions actually. Firstly, how bad is the Note 7 crisis for Samsung's brand? If you do have, maybe if you're just tuning in, we should reintroduce ourselves. I'm Alex Webb from Bloomberg's tech team, and maybe Mark.
Yep, Mark Bergen, also with Bloomberg tech team, filling in for other Mark.
And so then the question is, how bad is this for Samsung's brand, and can they recover in the long term? I don't know what your thoughts might be on that.
I think they could recover. I think it's really bad.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to me. I will curious to see how they respond to this. Samsung has been, especially globally in the U.S., they're one of the biggest marketing budgets, right? There's an argument that they sort of rivaled Apple because they just spent so much money on marketing, which is something that Apple's never really had to do. So they clearly have the channels that can go out and kind of treat this as like a PR disaster and do kind of the typical crisis management there.
Yeah.
I think that in some ways that Huawei has been someone, certainly in China, that's competed with Samsung, Xiaomi a little bit, although Xiaomi has suffered. I think there hasn't really been a strong Android handset maker, and anyone besides Apple. And I think Google maybe in 2 to 3 years with the Pixel, but I don't see Google immediately coming out this year.
Right.
So in some
frankly,
ways,
Google doesn't have the sales channels at the moment.
Exactly.
It's only in Verizon stores, and they don't have their own shops as Apple does. So that's something they've yet to build out and really go stratospheric.
So Samsung clearly is still a massive presence, and they've kind of been around for a long time, and they've been able to recover from previous crises.
And another question is, the talk that Samsung was trying to beat Apple to market, so they rushed to get the phone out, whether that caused the problem. I think our colleagues in South Korea wrote a story on this piece. It was actually the likes of Oppo and Huawei in China had been pretty good, and they got their phones out earlier this year. I think there probably was a race to market to ensure that Samsung had a competing product, particularly because the perception, even leading into the iPhone 7 launch, was that it would only really have incremental improvements on the previous generation. So that clearly creates an opportunity for competitors to let's try and come out with a blockbuster product, steal some market share, while Apple's sort of in a down cycle almost. There are some improvements in the iPhone 7, but everybody's really expecting the blockbuster upgrades to come next year in the iPhone 8. And so that's probably why they might have rushed.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that we had another earlier story that came out later, that said Samsung kind of initially, when they did testing on this, they couldn't find any of the similar that could kind of replicate the explosion. They thought it was a battery issue. Clearly, it was a lot larger than that. There's a lot of suspicion. I guess in Korea, there's been the management issues there, right? They're kind of sort of waiting for the Air to take over, and they've had a lot of mobile heads kind of come in and out over the years. So I imagine that there'll probably do a management shakeup.
But I think one of the points you alluded to earlier, like that the supply chain issues are crucial, and it really is it does give a huge amount of credit to Apple that Tim Cook was the head of Apple's supply chain before he became CEO, and I think the argument can be made that present-day Apple is as much his child as Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs perhaps is the driver behind product and the great innovation, but Tim Cook built the whole infrastructure which allows them to be vastly profitable, and they are heavily integrated with their supply chain. They have very tight control over their suppliers.
But this does point out that they're very dependent on the iPhone.
Right.
And that's maybe like a point you made earlier, that Samsung is not as dependent on one device or even kind of one division within the company.
We have a question coming in. What about Android? How is Google affected by all of this? We did tackle this a little bit just now. Clearly Android, Google's risking losing those customers. But I think maybe it's a good opportunity to talk a little bit about Viv, which is an AI startup which was built by the Siri team, who left Apple after selling the company to them, and have this startup now which has just been bought by Samsung.
Correct.
Maybe dig into that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, they built with some of the creators of Siri, the voice technology. They came out this new startup called Viv. They hadn't released a product, but there's a lot of people that what they've sort of promised was a second generation version of Siri that's much better, can do much more complicated voice queries like what's the weather going to be like tomorrow in San Francisco, near the pier, and it'll actually respond to you. So Samsung making that move is a really aggressive move on their part. Smart. Samsung has talked about they not just for their phones but for all their products, right? Their washing machine, their fridges. They eventually have a world in which you're going to be interacting with devices using your voice. This is something that Google has also been pushing pretty, with the new Pixel. They talked about the Assistant, right, which is sort of their next generation of search, as well as a voice interaction. So that's something where it's really important for Google now. Like the beginning of Android was getting Google services, their Maps, their Play Store onto phones, and now a lot of that is around getting their Assistant onto devices. So it was an interesting move from Samsung. There's been tension between Google and Samsung for years. I interpreted that as sort of, this is Samsung saying, we're doing this, we're going to try this our own way. They tried this previously with Tizen, which is their own proprietary software. Hasn't really gone anywhere.
I thought it was quite sort of opportune, the timing in some ways, because at the start of the week we have Google introducing the Pixel phone, which seems like a real jab at Samsung in some ways, because Google provides the software, Samsung does the hardware piece. Now Google's getting into the hardware piece, and then a couple of days later we see Samsung getting into the software piece.
Right. But I'm sure Google's not very happy about seeing Samsung's phones explode. I think for a long time now, Google has been really frustrated with the kind of fragmentation of Android, where you have everything from really expensive Samsung devices to incredibly cheap devices in the emerging market. They can't, like what Apple can do is, they turn on a new software update, and almost all the new iPhones have those. We have a really small percentage of Android phones that are running Google's latest software. So that's been a frustration that they've had, and with security updates, they have to go through the handset makers and the carriers.
But it basically seems though that everybody is gunning to emulate Apple's model, right? That Google realizes increasingly that to own the customer's FaceTime or with their phone, you've got to have the software and the hardware piece. Like if I've got an iPhone, I clearly can't go, okay, Google, and it jump up and start talking to me without opening the Google app. And Samsung, one imagines then, is perhaps also going in a similar direction, where they realize that to really, make the most of the data they're reaping from customers, as well as just selling the hardware, they've got to have an effective
and that was when Google released the Pixel phone. That's what they said on stage a lot, is the marriage of hardware and software, right, which is very much an Apple type proposition. I would argue that actually a lot of people are now emulating Amazon. Right, because out this morning, Amazon has news that they have a new music streaming service that's going to be tied to their home speaker. And when Amazon is done with the Echo device, which is their smart voice-controlled speaker, is moved into this new frontier market in a much more aggressive way than I think Apple and Google and people like Samsung have anticipated.
I really think the music stuff is fascinating, because we often forget that the whole Apple empire was fundamentally built around its music business to begin with. It was the iPod and iTunes, which iTunes was when it was released for PCs as well as for Macs. That's when the iPod really took off. And then a lot of the technology which was in the iPod Touch was then subsequently used in the iPhone, and they built their whole empire off the back of that. And it seems interesting, like, frankly, for me, I don't have an Amazon Echo at home. One of the reasons is that all my music's in iTunes. And it just doesn't make sense for me then to be trying to build a new one on Amazon. So, like, that seems to be a way of getting into that space and assuaging the concerns of people like me, right?
Do you think Apple needs to respond to this, to Amazon, and how would they do that?
Well, I mean, I think the response to, clearly Apple has Apple Music already, but as our colleague Mark Gurman, who's unfortunately not around today, but as he reported, they are working on, well, I mean, I think it was it a scoop at Recode had originally, or the information that Apple was working on an Amazon Echo, Google Home type device.
Makes sense.
And Mark had the sort of advanced the story a little bit and said that now Apple engineers are taking this product home, testing it out, which is, you know, the next step towards it actually coming to market. So I think that is their response to it.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm really curious how they're going to. I mean, if you think about Apple as a design company, do they take a different innovative approach to that? Do they come out of the box with something that's totally new? And I mean, that's sort of been the rub on Apple, right? Is that like they haven't done anything new, and right, and no one talks about the watch anymore.
One of the things I also thought was pretty interesting, Clayton Christensen, who's an academic at Harvard Business School, he was one of the early first people to write about the notion of disruption in the tech space, and he was on Bloomberg Television yesterday. He's got a new book coming out, and Apple has often been, well, they like to say maybe they're last to market with a product, but then the best. That's their kind of play.
Yep.
Now, one of the points that Clayton Christensen makes is that big, complex companies have very long capital allocation processes. So if you or I have an idea and we want to invest 10 million in a new product or product idea, at a big company, you've got to go 4 layers up in the management and then 4 layers down again to get the money. If you're at a startup, you just walk next door, knock on the CEO's door, and he says, right, here's the money. He might not have 10 million, but anyway, it's a lot faster. Now, Google, of course, has changed its structure. It has now the Alphabet holding organization. And I thought this was really interesting with the Pixel phone. It took a year to turn that thing around, right? From inception, the idea, all the way through to it coming to market was about a year. And that seems incredibly rapid. Admittedly, they don't have to build out the supply chain that Apple has because they're not coming to market with 40 million phones straight out the gate. But I think there was a certain amount, there's questions about whether Apple can learn from that. Then re-relating it back to Samsung, you know, if you come too fast, then you do risk having problems as well. So
yeah, and I mean, Samsung's kind of conglomerate structure, I have no idea how that's really organized and real insight. And with that, I mean, for Google, you know, it came after the Alphabet reorg, but the phone team was part of Google proper. It's Google the company. It's not one of their other bets. I do think that's been a huge issue for them, right? And that was part of the driving force behind the Alphabet was they wanted to behave more like a startup. They couldn't ship products, and they've been kind of like spaghetti at the wall. So it is impressive internally that they were able to focus that hardware group that was doing everything from kind of modular phones to Google Glass. All these sorts of a clear focus. Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, that's sort of. Do you see? How do you imagine Apple would reorganize it?
It's clearly very hard to know. I mean, even if Apple were to reorganize along that basis, they might not even tell anyone, right? You know, they might
not tell their employees either.
Exactly. Well, possibly. You know, they're very, very secretive. Right. So it's hard to cast aspersions about Apple's processes internally. But you know, they are often the last to market with a product. And as we said, often the product is very good, but it isn't the first one coming out there really changing the game necessarily. That's clearly what's also happening now at Samsung. They've got an activist investor, Elliott, coming in, asking for those sort of changes to, you know, just to break it into its constituent parts a little bit, add a little bit more clarity on exactly how it works.
Yeah, and I think with the smart home device, I mean, the Echo has done. Amazon's Echo has done pretty well. The sales figures something like 3 to 4 million. That's still that's not a mass market device, right? That's not iPhone level. And I think the jury's still out about whether that can actually scale to becoming an actual consumer device that everyone has in their home.
I think that, I mean, for Apple, it seems like something of a no-brainer, though, to come out with the device, because I don't imagine it requires that much capital intensity to come out with it. A lot of the technology they already have. You know, they've got Apple TV, they've got Siri, as much as there might be question marks about Siri's effectiveness. But you know, that is something that's improving clearly, and they're working on that. But that's a product they already have. So it's really a question of probably gluing together a lot of technology they already have. things that I think Mark reported is that the really high technology in that stuff is the ability to pick up voices and differentiate that from the surrounding environment. That's where they can possibly add some value.
Right, and that's where people critique the Amazon Echo for not being that advanced.
And also, I'm called Alex, which might be a problem with Alexa. I don't know. I haven't yet tried it.
Oh yeah,
so
and maybe your British accent wouldn't be able to do it either.
I don't have a British accent. You have an American accent. I'm sorry about that. I think that unless I don't think there are any more questions coming in right now, but I think we might then wrap up in that case. Thank you, Mark, for joining us this week, and hopefully we'll see you again on the show sometime soon. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. Please do follow Bloomberg's technology team on Twitter. We're @technology, pretty easy to remember. And have a lovely afternoon.